May 27, 1940. A French village near Dunkirk. A 33-year-old British officer crouches behind a crumbling stone wall. 5 German soldiers are advancing through the morning mist toward his position. He is not holding a rifle. He is holding a 6-foot English longbow, the same weapon English archers used at Agincourt 500 years earlier. The German sergeant leading the patrol is scanning for rifles, machine guns, grenades, the standard threats of modern warfare. He never thinks to look for a medieval weapon. The arrow flies. The sergeant drops without a sound. It is the last confirmed longbow kill in modern warfare. And the man who made that shot was just getting started. Welcome to History of World War II. This channel explores the untold stories and forgotten heroes who shaped the greatest conflict in human history. If you love deep research and documentary quality content, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss an episode. Now let us go back to understand the crisis that made this moment possible. By May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force faced complete annihilation. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 36 days. Now their panzers were tearing through France at 40 miles per day. The entire British Army was running for the sea. The numbers were devastating. Between May 26 and June 4, approximately 338,000 Allied soldiers would be evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. Most of them would leave behind their weapons, their vehicles, their equipment, their pride. Officers were burning classified documents in ditches. Sergeants were burying equipment they could not carry. Private soldiers were throwing away their rifles just to run faster toward the coast. The retreat had become a rout, but one British officer was not running. He was hunting. The British Army did not know what to do with Jack Churchill. His full name was John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. No relation to Winston. He had graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Armagh. He had spent a decade learning to be a conventional infantry officer. Then he quit. In 1936, he left the army entirely because peacetime soldiering bored him to exhaustion. He worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi. He appeared in films as an archer and bagpipe player. He rode motorcycles 1,500 miles across Burma and India. He once crashed into a water buffalo on a rural road. He represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo in 1939. 26th place out of 63 competitors from 14 nations. Not a champion, but good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. When war broke out in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined his regiment. But he did not rejoin as a normal officer. He brought his longbow, the same weapon he had used in international competition. 70 pounds of draw weight. Effective range of 200 yards in the hands of an expert. He brought his Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore of the type his ancestors had carried into battle centuries earlier. And he brought a set of Highland bagpipes that he had taught himself to play during his years in Burma. His fellow officers thought he was eccentric at best, mentally unstable at worst. The War Office had no regulation covering officers who wished to carry medieval weapons into battle against panzer divisions armed with 88mm guns. Churchill did not care what any of them thought. He had studied military history extensively. He knew that modern rifles were more accurate than longbows at long range. He knew that a Mauser could fire 15 rounds per minute, while a longbow could loose perhaps 10. But he also knew something that the tacticians in London had forgotten. In close combat, in the chaos of an ambush, in the terror of hand-to-hand fighting, psychological warfare mattered as much as raw firepower. A man charging at you with a broadsword and a Highland war cry was more terrifying than a man pointing a rifle from cover. And a man who could kill you silently with an arrow before you even knew he was there had an advantage that no amount of modern technology could match. He had a saying that would become legendary. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. Let me ask you something. If you saw an enemy soldier charging at you with a medieval sword while playing bagpipes, would you be more or less terrified than if he was just shooting at you? Think about that as this story unfolds. Churchill understood something that modern military planners had forgotten. War is not just about killing. It is about breaking the enemy's will to fight. And nothing breaks a man's will faster than facing something his mind cannot comprehend. His fellow officers mocked him at first. They made jokes about his eccentric equipment. They called him Fighting Jack behind his back. The jokes stopped after Dunkirk. The moment came during the retreat to Dunkirk. Churchill's company had lost 11 men in the past 72 hours. The Germans had better tanks, better aircraft, better coordination. British soldiers were dying by the hundreds along every road leading to the coast. Near a small French village, Churchill positioned his men for an ambush. A German patrol was approaching. 5 soldiers, a veteran sergeant, leading them. The Germans were approximately 30 yards away. Close enough. Churchill drew the bowstring back to his ear. The U creaked under the tension. His fingers found the familiar anchor point, the same position he had used 10,000 times in practice. He had made this exact shot countless times at targets. He had never made it with a human being at the other end. The arrow flew. The German sergeant dropped. The ambush erupted. Churchill's men opened fire. The remaining Germans scattered or fell. That shot is popularly credited as the last confirmed longbow kill in modern warfare. Some historians debate the precise details, but the story is widely accepted. A British officer had killed an enemy soldier with a weapon that belonged in a museum, and he was just getting started. Churchill came home from Dunkirk with his bow, his sword, his bagpipes. He had covered the retreat of his company. He had killed enemy soldiers with weapons that belonged in the 15th century. Most men would have been satisfied. Jack Churchill was hungry for more. Within weeks of returning from Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for a new unit that the War Office was secretly forming. They called themselves the Commandos. The British Commandos were born from desperation. In June 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The army had lost most of its equipment at Dunkirk. An invasion seemed imminent. Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded a force that could strike back at the enemy, even if only to prove that Britain was still fighting. The concept was simple but brutal. Small teams of highly trained soldiers would raid the coastlines of occupied Europe. They would destroy facilities, kill Germans, gather intelligence, disappear before reinforcements arrived. The training would be harder than anything the British Army had ever attempted. The casualty rates were expected to be catastrophic, volunteers only. Jack Churchill volunteered immediately. He requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos said yes. The Commandos trained in Scotland, in the mountains around Agnakery Castle. They marched 30 miles a day carrying full equipment. They practiced amphibious landings in freezing water. They learned to kill silently with knives and bare hands. They fired live ammunition over each other's heads during exercises. Men who could not keep up were sent back to their original units in disgrace. Churchill excelled at everything. He was older than most volunteers, but he was stronger and more determined. He could march longer, shoot straighter, fight harder than men 10 years younger. And he brought skills no other commando possessed. He could put an arrow into a target at 200 yards. He could play the bagpipes while marching into battle. He could handle a broadsword with the skill of a medieval knight. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the forgotten stories that shaped World War II, please take a moment to subscribe to History of World War II. We spend dozens of hours researching each episode to bring you documentary quality content. Your subscription helps us continue this work and bring these incredible stories to more people around the world. By December 1941, Churchill had been promoted to second in command of No. 3 Commando. The unit had conducted several small raids along the Norwegian coast. Then in November, the order came down from Combined Operations Headquarters. No. 3 Commando would lead a major assault on the German garrison at Vigsy, a small island on the Norwegian coast. The operation was codenamed Archery. The target was strategically important. Vigsy controlled access to a network of fjords that German ships used to transport iron ore from Sweden. The island housed a garrison of approximately 150 German soldiers, 4 coastal artillery guns, an anti-aircraft battery, fish oil factories that the Germans were using to produce glycerin for explosives. The plan called for a dawn assault on December 27, 1941. Royal Navy cruisers would bombard the German positions. Royal Air Force bombers would provide air cover. Then the commandos would land on multiple beaches simultaneously. Churchill requested permission to lead the first wave onto Maclay Island, a small fortified position guarding the approach to South Vigsy. Permission was granted. He requested permission to carry his sword and play his bagpipes during the assault. Permission was granted, though several senior officers questioned his sanity. The commandos loaded onto their transport ships on Christmas Day, 1941. They sailed north through the Arctic darkness, past the coast of Scotland into the Norwegian Sea. The temperature dropped below freezing. Ice formed on the deck railings. At 0845 on December 27th, the landing craft carrying Jack Churchill approached Maclay Island through a curtain of smoke. Royal Air Force Hampton bombers had dropped smoke canisters along the shoreline. The cruiser HMS Kenya was firing salvos at the shore battery. Churchill stood in the bow of the lead craft, fully exposed to enemy fire. The other commandos crouched behind the steel gunnels. Their commander remained standing. He had his bagpipes inflated and ready. The ramp dropped onto the rocky beach. Before any of his men could move, Churchill stepped forward into the freezing surf and began playing the march of the Cameron Men. The sound of the bagpipes cut through the explosions and gunfire like a blade through cloth. It was the most Scottish sound in the world, and it was coming from a beach in Nazi-occupied Norway. The Germans in the shore battery heard it and could not believe what they were hearing. They had been trained to fight British soldiers with rifles and grenades. They had not been trained to fight a madman playing music while walking calmly toward their guns. Churchill finished the tune, set down his bagpipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, hurled it at the nearest German position. Then he drew his broadsword and charged up the beach, screaming at his men to follow. The assault on Maclay Island was over quickly. Churchill led his men through the German positions systematically. The coastal artillery guns were destroyed with explosive charges. The anti-aircraft battery was overrun and captured. The German commander was taken prisoner along with his men. Churchill was everywhere during the assault. He appeared at the front of every attack, sword in hand, directing his men with shouts and gestures. The raid on Vigsy was the first major commando success of the war. It proved that small, highly trained forces could strike deep into enemy territory and inflict serious damage. The German High Command was furious. Adolf Hitler himself issued orders strengthening coastal defenses throughout Norway. 30,000 additional troops were diverted to garrison duty along the Norwegian coast, troops that could have been fighting in Russia or North Africa. A single raid by commandos had tied down an entire army. Here is a question I want you to think about. How many victories throughout history have been won not through superior firepower, but through sheer psychological impact? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. By the summer of 1943, Churchill had been promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. The Allied invasion of Sicily began on July 9, 1943. Operation Archery was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. 160,000 troops from Britain, America, and Canada landed on the southern coast of the island. Churchill came ashore carrying his complete arsenal. Scottish broadsword around his waist, longbow and arrows slung across his back, bagpipes tucked under his arm. His men no longer questioned his equipment choices. They had seen what he could do. By September, the Allies were invading mainland Italy at Salerno. The Germans had anticipated the invasion and reinforced the area. The beachhead came under heavy fire within hours of landing. Churchill's commandos were assigned to defend a critical road junction at the town of Vetri-sul-Mare, overlooking the Bay of Salerno. If the Germans captured Vetri, they could pour artillery fire onto the Allied beaches. For 5 consecutive days, Churchill and his men held Vetri against repeated German counterattacks. They fought from buildings, from ditches, from rubble. They refused to give ground even when ammunition ran low. Then came the night that would become legend. German forces had occupied the hills above the town of Molina, controlling a strategic pass. An observation post on those hills was directing artillery fire onto Allied positions. The observation post had to be eliminated. Churchill studied the terrain. A frontal assault up the hills would be suicidal. The Germans had machine guns covering every approach. Mortars zeroed in on the obvious routes. He decided on a different approach. He would take a single corporal and infiltrate the German positions at night. 2 men could move silently where 200 could not. Churchill and the corporal left British lines after midnight. They moved through the darkness using terrain features for cover. They avoided German sentries by crawling through drainage ditches and along stone walls. They reached the first German position just before dawn. Churchill spotted the glow of cigarettes in the darkness. German soldiers were manning a mortar position, relaxed, not expecting trouble. Churchill drew his broadsword and approached silently. He appeared out of the darkness like a ghost from another century. The Germans surrendered immediately. They had never seen anything like this officer with his medieval weapon and his calm demeanor. Churchill used his revolver lanyard as a rope to lead the first prisoners to the next position. He repeated the process. Each time he approached silently, revealed himself suddenly, demanded surrender. Each time the Germans complied. They were too shocked to resist. By dawn, Churchill and his corporal had captured 42 German soldiers and an entire mortar squad. They marched their prisoners back to British lines. He received the Distinguished Service Order for the action at Molina. The citation praised his courage, his initiative, and his leadership. It did not mention that he had accomplished the entire capture with a sword. Some things were too unusual, even for official military records. If this story is changing how you think about unconventional warfare, please hit that like button right now. It helps the algorithm show this video to more history lovers and takes less than 1 second of your time. By the spring of 1944, Churchill received orders transferring No. 2 Commando to Yugoslavia. They would support partisan fighters against German occupation forces. Yugoslavia had become one of the most brutal theaters of the war. German occupation forces controlled the cities, but communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito dominated the mountains. The fighting was savage. Prisoners were rarely taken on either side. In May 1944, Churchill received orders to capture the German-held island of Bra. The island controlled shipping lanes along the Dalmatian coast. A German garrison of several hundred soldiers held fortified positions. Churchill assembled his force: British Commandos and approximately 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. It was a mixed force with mixed capabilities. The assault began on May 2, 1944. The partisans were supposed to advance immediately. Instead, they hesitated. The partisan commanders saw the strength of the German fortifications and decided to wait until morning. Churchill was furious. Delay gave the Germans time to reinforce, time to prepare, time to call for support. But he could not force the partisans to attack. The assault resumed the following morning. Churchill led the British Commandos in a direct assault. The partisans provided no support. The Germans were ready. Machine gun fire swept the approaches. Mortar rounds exploded among the advancing commandos. Churchill pushed forward anyway, bagpipes playing. Sword at his side, the attack stalled. Men were falling. A German mortar team zeroed in on Churchill's position. They fired a salvo directly into the group of commandos gathered around their commander. The explosions killed or wounded every man except Churchill himself. He found himself alone on a hillside in enemy territory. His men were dead or dying around him. The Germans were advancing. Ammunition was exhausted. Escape was impossible. He did what any officer of his character would do. He sat down on a rock, picked up his bagpipes, and began playing Will the No Come Back Again. It was a Scottish lament, a song of farewell. A final act of defiance against an enemy that had finally caught up with him. The Germans approached cautiously. They could not believe what they were seeing. A British officer surrounded by the bodies of his men playing music while they pointed rifles at him. They did not shoot. They were too confused. Too curious. Perhaps too respectful of a man who faced death with such composure. A German grenade exploded near Churchill, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. The Germans transported Churchill to Berlin for interrogation. They were convinced that anyone named Churchill must be related to the British Prime Minister. They flew him to the capital under heavy guard, hoping to extract valuable intelligence. They were disappointed. Jack Churchill had no connection to Winston Churchill. T was simply an officer who liked swords and bagpipes. The Germans sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin. It was a special compound for prominent prisoners, including politicians, resistance leaders, and suspected relatives of important figures. For most prisoners, Sachsenhausen was the end. For Jack Churchill, it was merely an inconvenience. He immediately began planning his escape. He studied the camp layout, the guard rotations, the fence lines, the watchtower positions. He identified weaknesses in the perimeter. The prisoners in his compound had access to a small garden area near the perimeter fence. Churchill and his conspirators began digging a tunnel from a drainage ditch. They worked at night, used spoons and pieces of metal. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 other British officers crawled through the tunnel to freedom. They scattered into the German countryside. Churchill and a fellow officer began walking north toward the Baltic coast approximately 200 kilometers away. Their plan was to find a boat to neutral Sweden. For 2 weeks, they moved through Nazi Germany on foot. They traveled at night, hid during the day, stole vegetables from fields, drank from streams. They made it to within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast before their luck ran out. A German patrol spotted them and demanded identification. They were recaptured and returned to captivity. But not to Sachsenhausen. Churchill was transferred to a camp in Austria, deep in the Alps. In late April 1945, Churchill and approximately 140 other prominent prisoners were transferred to the Tyrol region of Italy. The SS planned to use them as hostages, but German army officers intervened. After a tense standoff, the SS withdrew. The prisoners were abandoned in a small Italian village. Most of the liberated prisoners waited for Allied forces to arrive. Jack Churchill did not wait. He began walking south toward Allied lines. He covered 150 kilometers on foot through the Italian Alps, crossing mountain passes, avoiding German stragglers. His ankle was injured. He had no food, no weapons, no identification. He walked anyway. After 8 days, he reached American forces near Verona. The Americans did not know what to make of the ragged British officer who appeared out of the mountains claiming to be a commando lieutenant colonel. Churchill had no documents, no uniform insignia, nothing to prove his identity. He convinced them by sheer force of personality, by the authority in his voice, by the stories he told of swords and bagpipes and German prisoners captured at knife point. The war in Europe was ending. Germany surrendered in May 1945. But for Jack Churchill, the war was not over. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific. Churchill immediately requested a transfer to the Far East. He wanted to fight the Japanese. He wanted to carry his sword into one more battle. The War Office approved his request. By summer 1945, Jack Churchill was on a ship heading east toward Burma, toward Japan, toward what he hoped would be the final chapter of his war. Then the atomic bombs fell. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. Churchill's reaction became legendary among those who served with him. He reportedly said that without the American atomic bombs, the war could have continued for another 10 years. It was a dark joke, but it revealed something true about his character. He was a man who thrived in combat, who found meaning in the chaos of war, who felt most alive when death was closest. German soldiers began telling stories about the British officer with the sword and bagpipes long before the war ended. They called him a madman, a berserker, a throwback to an earlier age of warfare. Some refused to believe he was real. Others hoped they would never encounter him in battle. Intelligence reports circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters describing the British officer who carried a sword and played bagpipes in combat. Some German officers dismissed the reports as propaganda. Others took them seriously. All of them underestimated what Churchill was capable of doing. The psychological impact of his methods was undeniable. German soldiers trained for conventional warfare found themselves facing something they could not process, something that did not fit into any category they had been taught to recognize. A man with a rifle is a threat, you understand? A man with a sword playing music while walking towards you is something else entirely. That moment of hesitation, that fraction of a second where the brain tries to make sense of what the eyes are seeing, that was Churchill's advantage. And in combat, a fraction of a second is often the difference between life and death. Churchill retired from the British Army in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had served for over 30 years, fought in one world war and several smaller conflicts, earned decorations from multiple nations. His retirement was as eccentric as his military career. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s. He became one of the first surfers in British history, riding tidal bores on the River Severn. He built radio-controlled model warships. He refurbished old steamboats. His daily commute became legendary. He would ride the train home from London each evening, and as the train passed his neighborhood, he would open the window and throw his briefcase out onto the tracks. Startled passengers assumed he had lost his mind. In fact, Churchill had calculated the exact spot where his garden bordered the railway line. The briefcase landed in his backyard every time, saving him the trouble of carrying it from the station. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. His obituaries struggled to capture his life. One British newspaper wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. A man who killed enemies with a longbow in the age of tanks. A man who captured prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns. A man who played bagpipes while mortars exploded around him. A man who escaped from a Nazi concentration camp and walked 150 kilometers to freedom. A man who surfed river waves and threw briefcases from trains, and refused to accept that the modern world had no place for medieval warriors. Here is what most people completely miss about this story. Jack Churchill was not the most decorated soldier of the Second World War. He was not the most successful commander or the most brilliant tactician. He did not win any decisive battles or change the course of history through strategic genius. What he did was simpler and perhaps more important. He proved that individual courage still mattered. He proved that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower. He proved that one man with enough determination could accomplish what armies could not. The next time someone tells you that the old ways are obsolete, that innovation has made everything that came before irrelevant, that there is no place for unconventional approaches in a modern world. Remember the British officer who brought a longbow to a gunfight and won? If this story moved, you hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about officers who captured prisoners with swords. Stories about soldiers who played bagpipes under mortar fire. Stories about men who escaped concentration camps and walked across mountains to fight again. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Norway? Our community stretches across the entire world. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you had ever heard of Mad Jack Churchill before today. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jack Churchill does not disappear into silence. This man deserved to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen. I will see you in the next one.